I'm really excited to share with you guys this next book. This goes out to all of my readers who love fantasy, who love mythical beasts, who love magic. This is the one for you. So it's called The Magnificent Monsters of Cedar Street. Cordelia Clay loves the work she and her father do together, healing remarkable creatures like dragons, squelches, and diggles in their home on Cedar Street. But their work must be kept secret. What would the people of Boston do to the creatures they label monsters? One morning, Cordelia awakens to discover that her father has disappeared with nearly all the monsters. With only a handful of clues, Cordelia must set off to find her father, with the help of her new friend Gregory, Iggy the farting Filch, a baby dragon, and a small zombie puppy, that is. Promise me, Cordelia, her father had said to her that day. Swear to me you will never tell anyone about the monsters we keep here. If people knew how many monsters Cordelia and her father were keeping, they would be afraid. They would demand that the monsters be kept in cages or shipped off to some foreign place or even killed. Perhaps they would want Cordelia and her father to be arrested. They didn't understand that everyone needed saving sometimes. Everyone needed someone to care. Even, perhaps, especially, monsters. Okay, now, because this is a fantasy, we know a lot of the creatures are made up, and a really helpful tool that the author has included in the very beginning of the book is a glossary of all of the mythical beasts. What they are, what they look like, how they act. And she makes comparisons to actual real life animals that we know. Now, one thing that helps me when I read fantasies, and I even with the details can't picture in my head exactly how the creatures look, I can type into Google and usually a picture will pop up too. So that is very helpful. So you might want to reference this beginning part as you're reading to help you visualize what these mythical creatures look like. Chapter 1. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Cordelia! Dr. Cornelius Clay spun around, and the lantern attached to his forehead bobbled slightly. In his oversized goggles, which were misted slightly from the drizzle, Cordelia thought he very closely resembled the species Cavoricus poison, otherwise known as the lionfish, a monster Cordelia had only ever seen in illustrated form on page 432 of A Guide to Monsters and Their Habits, Cordelia's favorite book. Cornelius's eyes darted nervously behind her. He had been anxious all night. What have I told you about wearing your mother's boots? I can hear you coming from a mile away. He's anxious. I bet that's some foreshadowing. Sorry, Cordelia wrestled the boot off her right foot and, balancing on one leg, allowed the moisture to drip out of its toes. She shoved her sodden sock back in the boot and wiggled her toes experimentally. Better. Blue Hills Park looked very different at night than it did during the day. During the day, hikers huffed red-faced in the cold along winding hiking trails. Children hunted the marshes for frogs, losing the occasional mitten and even boot to the sucking mud along the estuary. And fishermen returned again and again to the same fishing holes, breaking through the morning ice to drop their lines. It was a beautiful place, crowded with dogwood trees and lady slippers, herds of white-tailed deer, copperhead snakes. But during the day, even the wilderness seemed tame, almost deliberate, as if it had been made specifically for the enjoyment of its visitors. The hills and woods, the marshes, and the ribbons of streams that fed them, all of them had been named, surveyed, and bounded, and their outlines appended to new maps of the greater Boston area. Tamed and flattened like a dead butterfly pinned beneath glass, and now property of the newly formed Metropolitan Park Commissions. But at night, Blue Hills wasn't a park at all. It was a vast, strange, wild thing, alive with insects and movement. It watched Cordelia and her father with yellow eyes, winking in the grass. It tracked them by their echoes, bouncing news of their progress to great geometries of bats that passed back and forth overhead. It swept in on gusts of wind and touched their necks to make them shiver. It carried news of their skin into 1,000 different corners, whispering warnings of intruders. Ooh, man, that author used a lot of personification to describe what a habitat is like in the evening. Kind of spooky. At night, it was very obvious. They belonged to Blue Hills, not the other way around. At the beginning of the steep pathway they wound up and through the hills, Cordelia's father stopped. He squatted, his lantern swinging slightly, and brushed his fingers to the damp grass. Then he straightened up. "Look, Cordelia." He extended his hand to her. His fingers were streaked with black. "Ash," Cordelia whispered. Her father nodded solemnly. "We must be on the right track." Rector Crushing's wife, Mary Crushing, was the first person who had spotted a fire. On an evening stroll with her husband, a rhododendron bush had quite without explanation burst into hearty flames, nearly frightening her out of her skin. For several days afterwards, there had been a steady stream of visitors to the spot, claiming to see in the blackened husk of the bush various saints and spirits. Her husband had even declared this portion of Blue Hills Park sacred ground, and Miss Crushing had enjoyed several days of fame, though many accused her of being overly imaginative, and the minister of a rival church, Mr. Buchanan, had even suggested that witchcraft was involved. Then Miss Finch, who worked as a school teacher, and whom no one would ever accuse of having an imagination, had spotted another bush, this time an ugly pricker, go up in flames. This had provoked a roaring debate. Was Blue Hills haunted? Was it blessed? Was it cursed and harboring demons? Were the events, as the scientific community declared, merely a product of a bizarre chemical reaction stemming from various alkaloid concentrations in the soil? Only Cordelia and her father knew the truth. Okay, yay, good. I wonder what mythical beasts can make something burst into flames. So, if you are interested in fantasy and you're not afraid to rely heavily on imagination and pay attention to figurative language and lots of sensory detail to help visualize the characters and the situations that arise, then I definitely recommend this book to you, The Magnificent Monsters of Cedar Street.